They told me to stop, just like that. Stop teaching. Dr. So-and-so will handle this subject from now on. You're done. I was teaching the Gospel of John at our Theological Seminary. I had been studying Christianity my entire life, devoted to it with every fiber of my being. But I had questions, real questions that kept me awake at night, questions about passages in the Bible that didn't seem logical to me. That day, a student asked me something about John's Gospel. I answered honestly, based on my understanding of the text, but my answer went slightly outside their accepted doctrine, just slightly, and that was enough. The administrators called me into their office the next morning. Their faces were stern, disappointed. Your approach to answering questions is problematic, they said. We can't have you teaching students to think outside our established beliefs. I tried to explain. But these are legitimate theological questions. Shouldn't we explore them together? Shouldn't we seek truth wherever it leads us? Truth, one of them said, is what we've already established. Your job is to teach that truth, not to question it. I felt something break inside me that day. Not my faith, no, I was still completely devoted to Christianity, but something else, my trust in the institution perhaps, my belief that seeking truth was always welcome in God's house. I completed my studies anyway. I earned my master's degree. I continued serving in my church, leading the women's fellowship meetings. On the surface, everything looked normal, but inside, those questions were growing louder. During my time leading the women's group, I also provided counseling services. Women would come to me with their problems, their doubts, their spiritual struggles. And I found myself in an impossible position. How could I counsel them to seek truth when I had been told not to seek it myself? One evening, after a particularly difficult counseling session, I went home and opened my Bible. I started reading the Gospel of John again, the same book that had gotten me in trouble. But this time, I read it differently. I read it as someone genuinely seeking answers, not as someone trying to confirm what I already believed. The questions multiplied. Why did this passage contradict that one? Why did Jesus say this here but something different there? Why did the disciples seem confused about things that should have been clear if the doctrine was as straightforward as I'd been taught? I started researching, quietly, carefully. I read commentaries from different denominations, different perspectives. I studied the historical context, the original languages. The more I learned, the more questions arose. Months passed. I continued my church duties, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. During women's fellowship meetings, when someone would ask a theological question, I found myself giving the approved answers while my mind screamed with doubts. The breaking point came during a particularly heated discussion about the Trinity. One of the women asked me directly, "How can God be three in one at the same time? It doesn't make mathematical sense." I stood there, frozen, because I had asked myself that exact question countless times. I gave her the standard answer about divine mystery and faith, but I saw the confusion in her eyes, the same confusion I felt. That night, I went home and cried. I cried because I was lying to people who trusted me. I was giving them answers that didn't satisfy even me. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I decided to pray differently. Instead of praying the prayers I'd been taught, I spoke directly to God from my heart. "God," I whispered into the darkness, "I need to know the truth. Not what they tell me is true, not what I've been taught is true, but what you know is true. Guide me, show me, even if it's difficult, even if it changes everything." That prayer terrified me, because deep down, I knew it might lead me somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. The next few weeks were a blur of research and soul-searching. I read everything I could get my hands on. I studied comparative religion, something I'd never done before. I looked at Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and then, almost by accident, I picked up a book about Islam. I had always been taught that Islam was wrong, that Muslims were misguided. But as I read, something strange happened. the questions that had been plaguing me about Christianity. Many of them were addressed in Islamic theology. Not dismissed, not avoided, but addressed head-on with logical, coherent answers. I read about the concept of Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God. It was so simple, so clear. No Trinity to explain, no three-in-one paradox to accept on faith alone. Just pure, undiluted monotheism. I read about Jesus in Islam, still revered, still loved, but as a prophet, not as God incarnate. It made sense of so many passages in the Bible where Jesus himself seemed to distinguish between himself and God, where he prayed to God, where he said he didn't know things that only God would know. For the first time in months, I felt peace. Not the forced peace of accepting things I didn't understand, but the genuine peace of finding answers that satisfied both my heart and my mind. But I was scared. Terrified, actually. This wasn't just about changing my beliefs. This was about changing my entire life. My family, my friends, my career, my identity. Everything I had built was connected to my Christian faith. I spent weeks in internal turmoil. I would wake up Muslim in my heart and go to bed Christian in my actions. I led women's fellowship meetings while secretly reading the Quran. I counseled people based on Christian principles while my soul was crying out for Islamic truth. The final straw came during a Sunday service. The pastor was preaching about salvation, explaining how we needed an intermediary between us and God. As I sat there, I remembered reading in the Quran, "And when my servants ask you concerning me, indeed I am near. I respond to the invocation of the supplicant when he calls upon me." Direct access to God, no intermediaries needed. It was so beautiful, so simple. I realized I couldn't pretend anymore. That night, alone in my room, I performed my first prayer as a Muslim. I didn't know all the movements, didn't know all the words, but I faced toward Mecca and I surrendered. I surrendered my fears, my doubts, my old life, everything. And in that surrender, I found a freedom I had never experienced before. The word Islam means submission, surrender to God. And that's exactly what I did. I surrendered completely, and in doing so, I found myself. The journey wasn't easy. Telling my family was heartbreaking. My mother cried for days. My father refused to speak to me for months. I lost my job at the seminary, lost most of my friends, lost the community I had known my entire life. But I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained truth. I gained peace. I gained a direct relationship with my Creator. And most importantly, I gained the ability to answer those questions that had haunted me for so long. Today, when people ask me why I chose Islam, I tell them, I didn't choose Islam. Islam chose me. God guided me to the truth I had been seeking all along. And for that guidance, I will be eternally grateful.